And the interesting thing was that only 2 of them said that they were there because other people had asked them to come along. Everybody else said that, well, we are here because we heard about it on Facebook, we heard about it on Twitter, we've been following the live feed from the Occupy websites, that's how we got here. And they didn't really know a heck of a lot of other people. As it happens, because I know a lot of activists, because I've studied, done a lot of studies, and I'm kind of involved in a bunch of things myself, I ended up bumping into people I'd already knew. But they didn't come there bearing their organizational identities as members of Socialist Aotearoa. They just showed up. It wasn't, they weren't summoned by anybody. They just heard about it and they showed up. So, so let me talk a little about how I saw message framing working that day in Occupy Wellington. Okay, so it was clear to me that the protest meant multiple things to multiple people. That was very evident. But it became equally clear that participants themselves were not ambiguous about what they thought the protest was about. The sum total was ambiguities, in which case if you follow Charles Redding, the guru of OrgCom, he would call that type 2 ambiguity. As in the sum total is ambiguous, but to the people in it, it is not. Type 1 ambiguity is ambiguity when you feel something is ambiguous, right? So some protesters carried signs that use their own ideas and their own language, and they explain the meanings of these micro-level frames or these local frames in terms of local social justice issues. Okay. And many others who use signs use their own original language and frames, but made connections between local issues and the global economic justice concerns of the Occupy movement. Still others carried signs that appropriated or reproduced global frames in the form of slogans associated with the worldwide movement, but applied them locally and talked about how they were relevant in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And finally, a few people used the movement's global slogans to talk about global issues rather than local ones. Okay? So, make sense so far? Okay, so I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of each frame just so that you get a better sense of what people are saying. So here's one sign. It's not very clear, is it? It says, how to vote out New Zealand's inside jobbers. Okay, now, the person who is carrying the sign said the following. She says, I made this. She says, public protest like this is the way we should get the government out of power because nobody is paying attention to anything but rugby and the media will not report on how all the jobs are going to the boys. The Earthquake Commission is receiving a fortune while Christchurch is basically being ignored. So you can see how it's a local frame, local issue, right? So, and the specific issue she was talking about, the inside jobbers, was the fact that the earthquake minister, Jerry Brownlee, had appointed 4 people onto the earthquake recovery panel, including the former prime minister. All of them were conservative politicians, paying them more than $1,000 a day for their work, just to sit on a panel. So, here's a second, so no wonder people were upset. So, no more usury, corruption, and greed. Okay, so here, you can see how, this is obviously sort of like language that this person sort of came up with and just sort of typed it out and printed it out, but said, I only want to talk about this one which I made. Bailouts are not just in America. Do you know you and I both paid $400 each to bail out South Canterbury Finance? This ain't a global issue, mate. It's about Bill English and his mates. Okay, so South Canterbury being a finance firm that went bankrupt and Bill English being the finance minister that was responsible for the multi-billion-dollar bailout that was given to the finance firm. So here now we have macro frames and global local issues. So on some occasions, participants appropriated the frames of the broader movement to spotlight significant issues in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And such appropriation sometimes took the form of direct verbal and direct textual reproduction, okay? But sometimes it involved, interestingly, very creative cultural and historical interpretation. And one of my favorite slogans from the day that was tweeted over and over was called Me Noho Tahi Tēnā Pia Katika, okay? Which is Te Reo Maori. And the person who was talking about it to me says, I'm not putting that up right now, as you can tell, but that sentence means, come sit together and everything will come right. Okay? It underscores that Tangata Whenua, people of the land, are the original occupiers of this land, and that occupation is an indigenous issue. Okay? My own partner was Maori, and he was attacked and killed by the state, and I'm here to support and remember this fate of indigenous people throughout the world. Okay, so this slogan, Mi no hutahi tena pia katika, was twittered by protesters throughout the day. Right? And it's, to me, sort of a very creative and evocative appropriation of the whole spatial imagery of occupation, which is suggested by the broader Occupy movement. But it makes connections between local issues, indigeneity, and broader global and colonial histories, really. Right? So finally, we have macro frames and global issues. And the most common slogans, of course, were the 99% and the 1%, people greater than profit. And the explanations of these slogans that people offered me were also pretty global. They said things like, it's just a symbol of the idea that the 99% are more powerful than the 1%, and that people are more important than profit. That's a fundamental idea behind the Global Day of Protest, and it applies everywhere. So here, the interesting thing that I saw was, I was there for the entire day, but as the day progressed, the global frames became more prominent. And they became more prominent because people showed up with big cardboard cutouts and markers. And as folks from different locations, ranging from London to Tokyo to Paris to Cairo to Auckland, New Zealand, to Sydney, to Melbourne, as they were tweeting these slogans, some were moving faster than others, right? So the ones that became really iconic were the ones that started transmitting throughout that day. And of course, New Zealand being really early in the day, I think sort of the first half of the day they had a lot of sort of local language, but it became more and more sort of global as the day went on. It was actually pretty fascinating to watch. I sat down with this one guy with his Twitter account as he was saying, "Hey, guess what this person's saying? Guess what this person's tweeted?" That was pretty darn interesting. So, but that's only one aspect of that of some of the event ethnography that I did that day. So I also noticed, or rather, I spent a fair amount of time just observing and participating in emerging organizing. And throughout the day, people were making speeches, right? I mean, that's how rallies were. And the initial speeches were about justice and injustice. But as the day went by, the speeches started focusing on organizing. So the protest was initially in a public square, but we all marched ad hoc, to the Stock Exchange building and chanting and sloganeering. And so one speaker started asking, how do we make this viral? That started discussion about what we should do. Somebody suggested a typical Maori hui or a circular discussion. And then we went back to the bridge where the original protest started, and the discussion began about next steps and so on and so forth. And that evolution, I think, points towards a really important and often invisible aspect of protests. And that is, as participants spent more and more time with each other during the day, the protest itself became, in addition to a visible expression of dissatisfaction, a crucial site for activist organizing itself, okay? And a means by which they communicated and negotiated frames for the protest, right? So after a whole bunch of negotiation with each other, they, because there were some socialists there were some anarchists there were people with pretty different political ideologies. A lot of libertarians showed up as well. And so the only frame they could really agree on was the idea that they needed to emphasize real democracy by the people, for the people, and an economic system that works for 100% of the people. So that one sentence was repeated by activists throughout the day and ended up getting repeated in the mainstream media. And that sort of became a kind of frame for that day's events. So I think that this emergent democracy frame, while it appears to characterize a lot of activist discourse in the Occupy movement, was, I think, fairly significant in Wellington in particular, because 2 weeks after the first protest, the number of tents in the actual occupation, which they decided to do only during the day, had multiplied by about 3 or 4 times. There were about 60 or 70 occupiers there, and they stayed there for more than 3 months. And with the support of the city council, interestingly enough, the city council actually said, we think you guys are doing a great job, so we're going to help you stay here. Right? And so there was actually no police action in Wellington. The police actually helped the activists, and they stayed there for quite a long time. These are people making signs during the day. And this is this is the circular hui, the discussion group that happened during the day. So let me move on to a couple of implications of this. Okay, so a couple of issues for discussion that I think further help my contention that we need to understand contemporary activism as both virtual and organic. So what I think this does is cast some light on the nuances between global and local collective action frames in the Occupy movement. Okay, so the proliferation of signs that were virtually appropriated or reproduced from the global Occupy movement are, as I just said, further evidence of the impact that digital technologies are having on the spread of social movements. However, ways in which participants have aligned their own organic micro-level frames with the more global movement frames were, as I've shown you, quite diverse. So it was quite common to see the mingling of local and global issues and macro frames in ways that were not necessarily just simply aligned, rather local and global were both rendered sensible by that kind of intermingling. So I don't think that you can understand this intermingling just in terms of personalization, right? I mean, there is ambiguity, but I don't think it's just personalization. This is not an individual issue. You know, people weren't communicating with some kind of personal expressive ideal as a result of their engagement with the polysemic master frame. Instead, what they were doing was articulating what they considered to be